In this lesson, we're going to consider what happens to firms as they increase in size over time. We're going to study in particular what happens to their costs and how we describe this change in costs with some simple graphs. When you think about changes at a firm over time, it's important to distinguish between the long run and the short run at the firm. In the long run, we mean is when a firm can adjust not only its labor, but also its capital. It can change all its inputs to production, not just labor, not just capital, but both labor and capital. And we're going to focus on what happens as the firm increases its size. We're going to focus on what happens to the average total cost curve. One way to think about a firm changing its size is to think about scale. This is, of course, a picture of Gulliver as he's increased in size tremendously compared to normal human beings that they see on this island. And you can see it's not just his arm that has grown, not just his head that has grown, it's all parts of his body that has grown. When we think about a firm, we want to make sure now that we're thinking about not just the capital, not just labor increasing in size, but all components increasing in size. And before, when we considered a firm increasing its labor, hiring more workers, we imagined that its capital was fixed. So that would be a case, for example, where we're just increasing Gulliver's arm and keeping the rest of his body the same. Now, an increase in the scale of the firm or the size of the firm is when all the inputs to production increase. So let's consider what happens. And let's begin with a numerical example. And let's just go right to a graph to illustrate a numerical example. So in this case, we want to consider different amounts of production that the firm can produce. We'll just measure this as units 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we're going to represent dollars. This is the various kinds of costs of production, of producing the different quantities. Now look carefully. You can see the green lines represent costs for a smaller size firm with less capital. We're going to call that old fixed costs or old total costs. And there's also going to be a description of in blue, which is the firm after it's increased in size. So we're going to label that new fixed costs or new total costs. And what we're going to describe and show is what happens to these cost curves as the firm increases in size. So if you look down at the diagram, you'll see, for example, this green line here showing different levels of production at the firm before it increases in size. So right here, for example, you see the fixed cost of production when the firm is producing 1 unit. And here's the fixed cost of production when it's producing 2 units. Here's the fixed cost of production when it's producing 12 units. They're all the same. That's because there's fixed costs. It's about $300 here, fixed cost for this firm, regardless of how much it's produced. That's what we mean by fixed cost. And then the other part of this line, the green line going up over time, is the total cost, you can see. And to get total cost, we've added in the variable cost, the cost of labor in this case. And you can see variable cost varies. It increases as more is produced. That's as more workers are hired. And that total cost, therefore, is increasing as well. That's what you get when you add the variable cost to the fixed cost. Now, of course, what we're interested in now is the firm increase in its scale. In this case, it's going to have more capital, more fixed costs, and we're going to represent that by the blue line. There's our larger fixed costs. They're fixed because they're constant no matter how much the firm is producing. It's about $600 there in the picture. But also there's going to be total costs for the larger firm, and total costs are going to be what happens when you add fixed costs. So you can see the difference there between the flat blue line and the blue line that's increasing. And that difference is the variable cost, and we add that variable cost to fixed costs and we get total cost. And we're representing that new because it's an expanded, larger, newer firm. Now observe what's happened. For this smaller amount of fixed costs, it requires a different level of variable costs to produce than the case of when there's more capital. So for example, let's just look at the distance between these 2 points for a production of 11 units for the larger sized firm. The fixed costs are higher at that point than in the green, but the variable costs are smaller. the variable cost for the smaller size firm would be this whole distance here, the longer distance. And so you can see, because the firm now has more capital, it's able to produce the same amount of output, but in this case with a smaller variable cost, a smaller amount of labor costs. And because we're now adding a smaller amount of variable costs, even though the fixed costs are larger, the total costs are lower. So a production of 11 units, the total costs are lower than in this case for 11 units at the old size firm. Okay, so you can see now, therefore, for higher levels of production, the blue line is lower than the green line. Now, if you get out to the other part of the diagram over here, say for 2 units of production, the exact reverse happens. Now the blue line is higher than the green line, and the reason for that is that for the smaller amount of capital, the old fixed costs, there's a larger amount of variable cost that is needed. And so now the blue line is actually above the green line. Just to say it again, just look at the difference between the fixed costs. Let's look at it this way. The difference between the fixed costs in the diagram, difference between the fixed costs in the diagram here at say 3 units are larger than the difference between the variable costs. So in fact, it's more expensive to produce for the larger size firm at 3 units. And so now generally speaking, if you look at the total cost, you can see they cross each other. Total costs for the larger firm are larger at lower amounts of production, and total costs for the larger firm are lower at larger levels of production. And that's a fundamental thing about what happens when a firm expands in size. Now we can consider, since we've derived the total costs, old and new, we can now consider the average total costs, old and new, simply by dividing these total cost numbers by how much is produced. And now we'll look at that. So this picture, all that I've done, all that has been done in this picture is to take the total cost and divide it by the quantity produced, and then plot it in the diagram. So the quantity is the same as the previous diagram, the number of items produced. The vertical is still measuring costs, but the numbers are lower because we've divided by the quantity produced, so it's average total costs. And now you can see in the region where the larger firm has higher average total costs, say at low levels of production, the amount that is the total average total cost is higher there than the case over there with the smaller size firm. And that's because the fixed cost is larger and it's kind of dominating at these lower levels of production. When you go over here, you see you actually, by expanding the size of the firm, ATC2, you have smaller average total cost than for the smaller size firm. And so these cost curves now, you can see it's a very interesting pattern how they develop over time as the firm expands. At higher levels of production, the firm has actually lower average total costs, and it's vice versa at low levels of production. Now you could do this, of course, for larger levels of capital, more fixed costs, more expanded size of firm, and you can do this for many different levels, ATC1, ATC2, ATC3, etc. And when you do that, you get this concept of the long-run average total cost curve, which is really the minimum, the lowest level of all the possible average total cost curves. In this case, if there were only the choice between ATC1 and ATC2, you could trace out a long-run average total cost curve just by tracing out the lower points. So for example, over here, the green line is the lower point, and you come down here and you cross, and the blue line becomes the lower level. So just imagine tracing out the lowest of all those points there. There they are. That's called the long-run average total cost curve. It's the low points, regardless of how much is being produced. Okay, so we can make this a little fancier by considering more levels of capital. And let's just do that. So just derive formally what the long-run average total cost curve. So again, we want to sketch a different average total cost curve for each level of capital. We've done that so far with 2 levels of capital. And then we want to derive the long-run average total cost curve as the lowest of those average total cost curves for each quantity produced. We've done that for 2. Let's do it for some more. So that's a picture of ATC1. That's one ATC2, ATC3, ATC4, and we trace out the bottom of all those, and we see the long-run average total cost curve. There it is. Again, the low points of all the average total cost curves. So what we've done now is derive the total cost curve, average total cost curve for different size firms, and we've derived there for the long-run average total cost curve in a situation where the firm can adjust the size of itself, more capital, less capital, as well as the amount of labor it employs. Now this curve has some interesting characteristics which economists like to refer to as either economies of scale or diseconomies of scale. The word scale is being used because we're considering different scales, sizes of the firm. Like Gulliver is a larger scale than a normal human being when he goes to the island where smaller people live. So the three parts of the curve that you could distinguish, part of it, of course, there was declining average total costs. That was the left side of that curve. Well, in that period, in that part of the curve, we call it declining longer average total costs or economies of scale. Economies because as the firm grows in size, the average total costs are declining. So average total costs decline in that case. And then on the far right, you can imagine the part of the curve which is increasing, that's increasing long-run average total cost, sometimes called diseconomies of scale. And the middle is kind of constant economies, constant returns to scale are fixed, and that's neither economies or diseconomies. While these curves are nice enough in illustrating the different declining or increasing long-run average total costs, you might ask, what causes this? What causes declining long-run average total costs or economies of scale? Well, economists have been writing about this for a long time. In fact, it goes back to Adam Smith. In the famous book, The Wealth of Nations, he described economies of scale with a little story about a pin factory. Such a famous story that the Bank of England has put Adam Smith on their 20-pound note with a little picture just showing the pin factory story.
One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business, to whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. And the important business of making a pin is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by distinct hands, though in others the same man will sometimes perform 2 or 3 of them. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed. Those 10 persons, therefore, could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. Each person, therefore, making a 10th part of 48,000 pins might be considered as making 4,800 pins in a day. But if they had all wrought separately and independently, and without any of them having been educated to this peculiar business, they certainly could not each of them have made 20, perhaps not 1 pin in a day. That is, certainly not the 240th, perhaps not the 4,800th part of what they are at present capable of performing, in consequence of a proper division and combination of their different operations.
So what Adam Smith did, like other economists, walked around and looked at what was happening in the economy. And he looked at what was a common production, manufacturing plant at the time, the production of little pins. He noticed that if there were a firm large enough to have 10 workers, so it would have enough equipment to make the pins for 10 workers, it could produce 48,000 pins a day. That's those 10 workers. That's because they could specialize. The firm was large enough. One worker could stretch out the pin. Another worker could put the top on the pin. Another worker could wrap the pin in paper to make it easier to sell. They could specialize in these different parts of production. And he contrasted that to a situation where it was a much smaller firm, maybe just one worker with only a little bit of capital, just a place to work, a small room, and that worker couldn't specialize, he would have to put the top on the pin, he'd have to stretch the pin, he'd have to wrap the pin in paper to sell it. So as a result of that, he could produce only 20 or 1 pin a day compared to 48,000 pins a day that the 10 workers could produce. And so Adam Smith said, well, that's only 1/240th or 48,000th as much as when you have this economies of scale. So enormous economies of scale by having a larger firm and the ability for workers at this firm to specialize. You don't always get economies of scale. Of course, you get the diseconomies of scale. That could occur because as the firm gets larger, it's hard to manage. It's hard to coordinate. People get in each other's way. And so as it expands, you can never get into a situation where average total cost is actually increasing. And of course, economists call that diseconomies of scale. It's possible to have all this within a single firm. And so this is the typical long-run average total cost curve, where you get a section where there's declining long-run average total costs, a section which is constant long-run average total costs, and a section which is increasing long-run average total costs. Whether this is a feature of what happened in 1776 when Adam Smith wrote, or it's of current times, it's a phenomenon that's very important in explaining how firms change over time. And this little curve and the concepts of economies and diseconomies of scale help understand that. Thank you.